Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. All right, so I'm going to start right in. Today is one of those days when there was so much news that normally that overwhelms me, but for some reason today it just seemed to go bang, 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 bang into a certain kind of order. And you've asked a lot of questions about it, and I will do my best in the next half hour to get to all of them. I mean, maybe not all of them, but to get to all of the major ones that you asked. People started out by asking about Marco Rubio's speech in Munich. And while to some people that may sound like, why do I care? You actually care a lot. That Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave a speech over the weekend at the Munich Security Conference. Now, the Munich Security Conference started in 1963, and it's a really interesting organization because it's not a place where they do deals. It's not a place where, partners go off for side conversations. It is really a forum for different countries to talk about security issues around the globe, not to cut deals, but to hash things out. So it's a place where there's a lot of signaling that goes on. Now, coming out of World War II, the United States and its allies and partners, so that's allies from the war and people who later on become allies and partners, proceeded with foreign affairs with a set of principles that said that it was possible to achieve world peace so long as you based it on three things. The first of those was representative democracy. Everybody should have a say in their government. The second of those was free trade. And by that, that's not nobody ever has tariffs. That means that essentially you're going to work to have fair agreements around the globe with regard to trade. And you know what, I'm not gonna explain to you the ways those tariff systems worked, because it didn't mean there were open borders for trade. But what it did mean was that we had freedom of the seas, which was a principle that Churchill and FDR laid down in the Atlantic Charter before the U.S. even got involved in World War II. And the freedom of the seas is really important because it means you can have container ships go around, and it means that you can move grain if a country is starving and so on. So they called for representative democracy, free trade, relatively free trade, and international agreements. And by international agreements, they meant things like NATO. They meant things like the financial agreements we have around the world. They meant things like the World Health Organization, a number of I'm sorry, my guy says I haven't left room for captions. Sorry about that. I hope that's better. A number of different things that the idea was that this would sort of create a web around the world that would create norms. It would mean that people visited each other's countries and people would understand in the United States what life was like in the Czech Republic and so on, so that people felt more like they were part of a global world rather than the idea it was their nation against others. Now, that has been wildly successful. It has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. It has prevented a world war. It has spread human rights around the countries that adhered to these principles. It has been wildly successful. However, and I don't really have time to go into the reasons why that system began to break down in the 1980s and the 1990s. But suffice it to say that with the fall of the Soviet Union taking away sort of the other side of that, in the United States and also in other allied countries or partnered countries, they started to believe that simply by spreading capitalism, you would also spread democracy, that those two things would go hand in hand. And we now know that's not true. But what began to happen in the 1980s and in the 1990s was that this system started to move money dramatically upward. So in the United States, for example, between 1975 and about 2000, you see 2018, you see more than $50 trillion moving from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. And that creates real instability in a number of the countries like the United States that are behind this idea of a foreign set of organizations to create this world that could avoid a world war. So this is the thing that has fueled the rise of right-wing parties, is the economic and therefore the cultural instability that is in those societies because of the system that they have, that populists, right-wing populists, have blamed on migrants, for example, or some kind of other, rather than on the policies that were enacted in places like the United States that enabled that money to move upward. Anyway, when Trump took office, he quite volubly, he was quite loud about the fact he was going to get rid of that international system. And last year at the Munich conference, you may remember J.D. Vance gave a really in-your-face speech to European allies, essentially saying that the United States was going to be throwing its weight behind the idea of autocracies, that the democratic system hadn't worked, free trade hadn't worked, international organizations hadn't worked, and we were going to pull away from all of those things. And instead, we're going to ally with countries like Viktor Orban's Hungary or Vladimir Putin's Russia, where they really strongly believed in nationalism that kept out people of color and black people, and that reinforced Christian hierarchies of race, for example, of gender, of race and gender, but also of class. And J.D. Vance was very in your face about that. And Europe has been sort of reeling since then, Europe and our allies going, what is this even going to look like? And Trump piled on to that with his tariffs, saying, we're no longer going to have free trade. The U.S. is going to use its economic might to force you to do things based on our ability to say, no, you can't send anything to us and we won't buy it. We're also not going to promise that we're going to protect you. You're kind of on your own. So, and we've pulled out of the World Health Organization. We've threatened NATO. We've pulled out of the climate change initiatives and all those pillars that had balanced that foreign policy and reflected domestic policy at home. All right. So over the weekend, Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave a speech almost exactly a year after J.D. Vance's speech, and everybody was like, what are we going to see coming here? Because, you haven't pulled out of NATO, but you're also really cozy with Russia, and, and these tariffs are bonkers because some days they're on, some days they're off, and the difference seems to be who pays Trump when. What is this going to look like? Rubio gave a speech that essentially reinforced what Vance had said last year. And what he said was that America, the United States of America, believes that it shares a Western civilization, those are his words, with Europe. And that civilization, as he would call it, is under siege. And he didn't specify in that speech that it was under siege by any particular country, but he did talk about migration and how migration was undermining the very nature of that Western civilization. Now, I've written about this a lot. I've talked about this a lot. This is sort of a far right fantasy that has been part of American society since at least the beginning of the 20th century. The idea that somehow immigration is going to destroy what America really stands for. But when Rubio talked about that Western civilization, it was really kind of bizarre, because there were no indigenous people in it. And anybody who studies indigenous history will tell you that the very nature of the United States of America and what became the United States of America is dramatically impacted by relations with indigenous Americans. So there are none of them. No Black people, even though, of course, Black Americans or Black settlers, Black people, I should say, were the first Europeans to set foot on what became the the land that became the United States of America. There was a Catholic and a Muslim who came in the late 1400s, early 1500s. But of course, Black Americans have been part of the polity that became the United States of America since 1619. Muslims have been here, part of the United States. They fought in the American Revolution. Enslaved people were often Muslim. And certainly there's no way to do American history without Black Americans in it. Many of us actually think that the Black experience is really the central experience in America. And curiously, Rubio tied his own history not to his parents' arrival from Cuba in 1956, part of the same kind of migration from Latin America that the Trump administration is currently trying to criminalize, but rather he tied himself to Spain, to 18th century Spain. I mean, the whole thing was just really weird. But what it showed was that the administration is now firmly committed to the idea of turning the United States of America into a white Christian nationalist nation. And if you think about the kind of advertisements you're seeing for candidates running in 2026 who are openly embracing white nationalism, or the way that the Department of Homeland Security social media accounts are talking, or the things that J.D. Vance is saying, or the things that Donald Trump is saying, the idea that, that migration from what he called, I don't know if I can say it on YouTube, blank hole countries and all that is destroying America. That's a complete reversal of what the United States of America has always stood for. We've always had that strand in the United States, but it's never determined who we are. We are a nation of immigrants. That's just a fact. And this idea that there is some kind of special modern day whiteness is also, it's just so completely ahistorical. It's hard for me even to articulate all the ways in which that's wrong. Maybe someday I'll do a talk on that. But it is also a demonstration that the administration has embraced fascism. And I talked to you about what that ideological system was. And I'm going to do a little bit of a rabbit hole here. And that's that there are people in our country who seem to get upset when you use terms that are accurate. So, for example, there's been pushback on the use of the term concentration camp for what is happening to detainees that are being put in the camps, for example, in the camp at Fort Bliss in Texas, for example. I think it's called East Montana. That's just what it is. It's not a death camp, but it just meets the definition of a concentration camp. And that's how I'm using the word fascist here. The United States of America's government is now a fascist government that is different than the Nazis were, different than Mussolini's government was, different than Spain was, but that still has the hallmarks of fascism. And, I split hairs on that for a while because of the difference in the economic system between Trump's personalist system and a normal fascist system, but that's been resolved. So we're there. But from there, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, went on to try and prop up Viktor Orban, who's facing an election on April 12th, if I'm correct, in which he's in real trouble because people in Hungary don't like what he has done there, overturning their democracy and grabbing all of it into his own hands. So the reason that you care about that speech is, first of all, because it demonstrates very quickly how the United States government is taking a very different position than the United States has ever taken before. I mean, this is new and it's big, but also because our our allies and partners, if you will, want no part of it, and what has happened is really interesting. So let me see if I can call up these numbers for you. Trump made the assumption early on that if he simply put really high tariffs around the United States, that somehow money would pour into this country, which was a model that he was using from the late 19th century. And it didn't make sense at the time. If you listen to me, you know that I was like, this just isn't going to work. And this is what economists all said as well. But somehow he got it in his head that if he put high tariffs on things, that he could get rid of income taxes. And that the costs for running the United States government would come from other countries. Somehow, I don't know if he believed it or not, but he insisted that foreign countries pay tariffs. They do not. People at home pay tariffs, and this has become very clear since he has been putting these tariffs onto other countries. But there was an assumption in that the might of the economic system of the United States of America, which is very, very strong, would enable Trump to do whatever he wanted to do. And that is not what we have seen. So, with the United States essentially advertising to the rest of the world that we're going to go it on our own now. Now, that's not entirely true. We're not ripping up all of our agreements by any stretch of the imagination. But those people who used to be able to count on the United States to respond with NATO if they got attacked are suddenly not so sure about that. And so one of the messages coming out of Munich, out of the Munich Security Conference, was that other countries need to be able to protect themselves without the United States of America as quickly as is humanly possible. And that's going to do a number of interesting things. So first of all, you are starting to see other countries making alliances without us and starting to develop their own military capabilities. So Canada, for example, has recently, Mark Carney, the leader of Canada, has recently said that Canada is going to start really beefing up its defense industry as quickly as it can because it doesn't want to rely on the United States anymore. Well, of course, this is a problem for the defense industry in the United States of America, unless the Trump administration covers for the business it's going to be using by throwing more and more and more money at it, which is what it currently seems to be doing. But that's a real problem for the rest of us, and I'll explain why in just a minute. So you're seeing countries decide that they're going to create their own militaries that stand on their own intelligence systems because they don't really trust the United States intelligence systems any longer. And they're going to work with each other in ways that exclude the United States. Now, one of the things about these partnerships that we've had in the past is that you're much stronger together. That's always been the case. And this is one of the things that a number of people said to the Americans in Germany, in Munich, was that you're going to be weaker, you're not going to be stronger. And you can already see that. I mean, one of the things that you're seeing in Germany is that Germany has just inked a deal with Ukraine to start being trained by Ukrainian veterans on the use of drones and anti-drone capabilities. Because I've talked to you about this before, the Ukrainian use of drones has revolutionized warfare. And I made a huge deal about that when the Ukrainian drones took out a whole airfield of planes, and everybody was like, "You're a warmonger. Why are you talking about this?" Because as a historian, you look for technological changes that dramatically alter some aspect of human society. And the Ukrainian use of what are wildly cheap drones. They're they're less than $1,000 a piece for the initial piece of hardware that can turn around and take out an $800 million plane or whatever they're worth, or ship, is a kind of asymmetry in the expense of weaponry that we just have never seen before. So it's going to revolutionize warfare. Well, Germany's going to be trained in that. And so far, anyway, the United States does not have a similar deal. So you can see other countries beginning to depend on themselves for defense. And Europe, of course, has now stepped in where the Trump administration has walked away from funding Ukraine's defense against the attacks by Russia. Europe has stepped in to make up that difference because they're extremely concerned about Russia's potential invasion of other European countries in addition to Ukraine. But there's a trade aspect of that as well. If the United States is going to pull out of all these agreements, at first other countries tried to appease Trump, right? They tried to work with him. But then when it came clear that there was no working with him, that he basically wants his own payoffs, but then he changes his mind and, you don't know what he's going to do next, they have started to make their own major agreements with each other without the United States. And there again, Canada has led the way in starting to create a deal between the European Union, which is a huge economic bloc, and parts of the Indo-Pacific, another huge economic bloc, without the United States of America. And what you're seeing here is the increasing isolation of the United States from the world order. And Trump just yesterday, I guess it was, it gave a big social media tweet saying, America's stronger than ever. We have higher income. We have all these things better than ever. And that's just simply not true. We're being, I think of it sometimes kind of like a railroad track where we're getting pushed to the side and the rest of the trains are going faster and faster, and us pulling out of the attempt to move forward into new technologies for energy and instead moving backward into fossil fuels. All the things that he's doing to prop up his own cronies is really, really setting the United States backward going forward. Similarly, the United States removal of itself from the World Health Organization and our refusal now to continue to pursue the investigation of a certain branch of vaccines is mind-boggling. I mean, Americans are going to die because of these decisions, while the rest of the world is going to continue to move forward. So that's the story in Munich. But there's a story about Munich, but there's a story at home as well. And that's one that has been a little bit hard to see, I think, with so much going on with ICE and with Border Patrol and with the federal agents that are putting in place this draconian policy that goes along with the white nationalism, trying to get rid of as many brown and Black Americans as they possibly can, and to treat them as cruelly as possible. I don't think you can any longer look away, obviously, from the concentration camps, but also from what seems to be a deliberately cruel system designed to get people to leave on their own and to make sure other people don't come. All being done in our names, by the way, and all being done by the people we elected to put in office. At home, these policies that Trump has put in place, the tariffs, the backing away from world trade, the backing away from international agreements, and the including U.S. aid, and the deportation or detention or threats to so many of our workforce has created real stagnation in the economy. And those numbers are starting to come out today. So one of the things that has become clear since we're starting to see numbers from 2025 is that while Trump has been yelling about how great the American stock market is, it has lagged significantly behind stock markets in other developed countries. That is, while the US stock market has grown, it has not grown at the same rate as other countries did, even though while Biden was still in office, we had the strongest economy in the world. That has really stopped dramatically. We also have found that in 2025, US stocks compared to stocks around the world is down. We have the worst year comparatively in that ratio since 1995. So you can see the US economy starting to slow down, starting to really kind of sag a little bit. One of the other things that we have learned very recently is that in 2024, the United States added about 1.5 million jobs, 1.46 million jobs. In 2025, it added only 181,000. So you can see hiring is falling off. And you're also seeing frustration on the part even of places like the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, who pointed out, I think it was last week, that when Florida put in place a system that was designed to make sure that undocumented immigrants couldn't work in the state. I don't know if you remember that, it was in 2023. What it essentially did is it's absolutely stopped job growth in Florida and made it so that there aren't farm workers and there aren't construction workers really to be had in the state of Florida. And in order to combat that, today, I think he's the Attorney General of Florida, yes, reacted to that piece by the Wall Street Journal by saying the answer for Florida is to get high schoolers working in those professions, which I promise you is not what a lot of parents dream of for their children, that they will go onto construction sites. He didn't talk about working in the fields, but the idea that getting rid of undocumented immigrants is going to mean child labor is something that, when people suggested it before Trump took office, was dismissed as being absolutely scare tactics. And yet, on the Fox Business Channel today, that's what Florida's Attorney General suggested. You're also seeing something else here, and that is related, and that is real panic on the part of a number of agricultural leaders that the agricultural sector in the United States is in danger of collapse because it's lost its markets at the same time that it's lost its workers. And there's been a real push on people in Congress to do something because the when the Republicans passed their July 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act, they did something kind of sneaky that has kind of fallen under the radar screen. And that's that normally Congress passes what's called a farm bill. And it passes, I think it's every 5 years. I don't remember. I haven't been reading about it lately. But what's in the farm bill is a mixture of things that both Republicans and Democrats wanted. So Republicans get subsidies, for example, and things that they want, and the Democrats get things like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which, for very weird historical reasons, sits in the Agriculture Department. That is a weird story. And they get USAID, which bought billions of dollars of food from American farmers. But what the Republicans did with their July budget reconciliation bill is they peeled off the things they wanted and did not pass any of the things that traditionally the Democrats pass or the Democrats want. And those are the things that support the agricultural sector by putting surpluses into supplemental nutrition assistance, for example, or into USAID and into some other programs as well. So there is real concern that the agricultural sector is going to take an extraordinary hit. At the same time, we are seeing real problems in the commercial real estate sector, not probably because of anything Trump has done so much as the fact that since COVID, people really didn't go back into offices. And so while real estate in general is pretty stable, commercial real estate, which is highly leveraged, is in enough trouble right now that people are starting to send up real warning signs. There is also the issue that and this is something that has been very hard to pin down. There was finally an article about it today. But remember, Trump, for all that he talked about not getting involved in foreign wars, has in fact struck, I think it's 8 countries: Iraq, Somalia, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Nigeria, and Venezuela. And now, of course, after having a huge buildup outside of Venezuela, he is moving the fleet over toward Iran. This is really expensive. The kind of strikes that he is doing. He's launched at least 658 air and drone strikes against those countries that I named. And we are continuing to attack small boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, although it remains completely unclear that this is anything other than illegal and perhaps a war crime. That stuff's expensive. At the same time that the Republicans in their July 2025 bill extended the tax cuts on wealthy Americans and on corporations. So earlier this month, the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, and you often see them referred to as the CBO, and they're very good. They piss everybody off, so you know that they're doing what they should do. They projected that the deficit for this year, which ends on September 30th, 2026, the deficit, and remember, there's a difference in the deficit and the debt. The deficit is the difference in a year between how much the government takes in and how much it puts out. And this year, the deficit will be $1.85 trillion, which means that for every dollar that the U.S. takes in this year, it will spend $1.33. Now, remember, back in the Clinton years in the 1990s, we were operating in the black. But since then, we've had the George W. Bush tax cuts and we've had the Donald Trump tax cuts. And we've had the unfunded wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have had Trump's new military adventures. The mounting problem of both the deficit and the growing debt because of that means that we're spending an enormous amount of our tax dollars simply servicing the debt, simply paying the interest on that debt. And the Republicans claim that their tax cuts are going to so dramatically increase economic growth that that's going to take care of this economic dislocation here, but that's never happened so far. So and there's no sign that it's going to. So we've sort of got all of these things mounting. That is this white nationalist project, this idea of getting rid of that post-World War II world that created this stability and prosperity and more human rights. Getting rid of that, instead of bringing this wonderful golden age that Trump is talking about, certainly appears to be tearing up the US economy, as well as human rights in the United States, and as well as our security, as we have fewer allies and as other countries start to say, hey, maybe we should get nuclear weapons too, because we can't trust the US to be on our side with their nuclear weapons the way we have done since World War II. So that thing right there, the idea that this project of the Trump administration is more and more obviously creating a dramatically poorer and weakened United States is the real story of this moment. And yet I'm not quite done yet today, because one of the other things that you're really starting to see that you asked about is that the Trump family is making money hand over fist. And it's making money with merchandise, of course, with things like, I think you saw that Trump's lawyers have applied for trademark rights on his name if it goes on an airport, so that, theoretically any airport that becomes the Donald J. Trump International Airport will have to pay him a licensing fee, which is what he has done with his Trump buildings all over the world. And today, I don't know if you saw it, but the head of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, or the CFTC, has said that he's going to work hard to make sure that states can't regulate the prediction markets, which are essentially betting on basically everything that isn't sort of established sports betting, for example, because the argument he is making and that Trump is making is that this is essentially like a stock market. So they're saying, well, you can bet on what you think electricity prices are going to do. But the kicker to that is you can bet on anything nowadays. And one of the things you can bet on is what the president is going to do next. And here's a news flash. The Trump family is opening its own prediction company. So, I mean, the ability for self-dealing there, again, is off the charts. You're also seeing the money that the Trump family is making in cryptocurrency, and that too is off the charts, including with the purchase by one of the heads of the United Arab Emirates, the guy who's in charge of one of their big sovereign wealth funds, buying 49% of the Trump cryptocurrency company, World Liberty Financial, days before Trump went into office. He did it with an upfront payment of part of it of $500 million, of which $187 million went directly into the Trump's pocket, and another about 31%, at least 31, I'm sorry, not percent, $31 million went directly into the pockets of the Witkoff family, which helped to start World Liberty Financial. That's Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's special envoy to the Middle East and special envoy to Russia. So you're seeing that that Trump family making more and more money. So you've got, and I'm going somewhere with all this. You've got Trump. his magical economy that was supposed to help out all those people who were mad at the time at Biden, that economy is not delivering. And it doesn't look like it's going to deliver the way Trump promised. You're also at the same time seeing extraordinary corruption, both for Trump and in Trump's cabinet officials like Kristi Noem, for example, the Secretary of Homeland Security, who is all over the news for her egregious behavior, her insistence on private planes that are extremely expensive that we are paying for, as well as the fact that she's essentially splitting control of her department with a person who is allegedly her affair partner, Corey Lewandowski. So there is this tension building up against the Trump administration. And that is what I am describing to you is showing itself in, I think, real fear on the part of the administration that they're not going to be able to swing the 2026 elections their direction, no matter what they try. Now, you asked a lot about the SAVE Act, and that's this act that is designed in such a way that it's going to throw a lot of people, especially women, transgender, and somebody pointed out to me, adopted people off the voting rolls, because you're supposed to have a birth certificate that matches your current name or a passport, at the same time that they've closed a lot of places where you previously could get passports. I mean, this is really obviously a voter suppression attempt. But before you panic about that, you should definitely be worried. But before you panic, do remember, first of all, that this is unconstitutional. But second of all, it passed the House of Representatives, yes. But right now, anyway, it does not have even a majority vote in the Senate, let alone the 60 votes it will need to get past a filibuster. That is, even all the Republicans aren't on board. And one of the things that in part, for all the reasons I just listed, but also in part, it's not clear that the people that they knock out of the polls are not going to be Republicans, because this year Democrats are really motivated to get to the polls. Republicans are not. So if it's a question of going down into your basement and finding your birth certificate, a lot of Republicans might just be like, no, I'll skip it this year. But one of the people that you can watch on this is Susan Collins, the senator from Maine, who came out today to say she's in favor of the act. And that's a sign to me that that she doesn't ever think it's even going to come up for a vote, because in the state of Maine, at the last election, voters overwhelmingly rejected a voter suppression measure. So she knows at the state level, the SAVE Act is going to be really unpopular. And yet she came out and said she was for it. That says to me she doesn't ever plan to have to take a vote on it. She wants to play it both ways. She can say to Trumpers, yeah, I was for it. But then when it never comes up for a vote, she hopes that other Mainers won't notice that she said she was for it. So that is, I think, a sign that, well, we definitely need to worry about SAVE. You got to make sure you're registered, your friends are registered, that you have the right paperwork and so on, that does not seem to be moving as quickly anyway as the Trump administration would like it to. But there are other things to look at as well for why I think it's reasonable to think that the Trump administration and the MAGA Republicans are really worried. The first of those from today happened in Iowa. And that's that in Iowa, the lawmakers in the state are starting to try to pass measures that will dramatically curtail the ability of the governor to do anything. Well, if you expected there to be a Republican governor and you were a Republican, would you take those abilities away from him? Of course not. This is pretty clearly a sign that even in Iowa, they are very concerned that the election is going to swing to the Democrats in Iowa. That was something to watch. But here's another thing. Have you noticed that the actions of federal agents with ICE and with Border Patrol are so unpopular that there are absolutely knives out for Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem? And those knives are not only in the people that you would normally consider opposed to what she is doing. That is, the people on the streets, the progressives, the Democrats, the independents. The people who have been out in front on going after Kristi Noem are the people at the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is owned by Murdoch. It has a number of really terrific writers, and they are certainly not ideological writers. But it's hard to imagine that Murdoch's paper would be first out of the box attacking Noem the way it is without some kind of positive nod from somebody farther up the food chain. And they've been all over Kristi Noem with this expose that came out, I think, over the weekend. Now, today, there is yet another expose, this one in NBC News. And this one is from within the Coast Guard. People in the Coast Guard are talking about how Noem has taken away their primary mission of search and rescue and interdiction of drugs, and has replaced it with deportation flights. And they're like, we're not getting our job done. We're losing people because we can't be out there in the water the way we're supposed to save people. That's significant, not only because it indicates disapproval within the Coast Guard, but also of all the law enforcement agencies that you know and have relationships with. Like, is there one that's more popular than the Coast Guard? The Coasties around here, like, how many people do you know who at some point in their lives have been rescued by the Coast Guard? So it's not a good thing for the Coast Guard to come out and say, we're really unhappy with this particular cabinet member. Today, Kristi Noem's own spokesperson, Tricia McLaughlin, the one who always says the totally outrageous stuff, there was a story in Politico that she is stepping down. She is leaving DHS. So you can see the pressure of the American people on this administration, as they are, as I say, doubling down on white nationalism. But now to end with another question that you asked about that I think really embodies a lot of that. And that is why the Federal Communications Commission, under Brendan Carr, who is an appointee of Donald Trump, pressured CBS to refrain from airing an interview that Stephen Colbert did with Texas Senate candidate James Talarico last night. Think about where we are right now in this country with the Epstein files. So, people were surprised, I think, that the Epstein files had got the kind of legs that they did to get Congress to force or try to force the Department of Justice to release them, and that they've just had staying power. And I think the real reason that they have had staying power, and by the way, I just mean this politically, the stories, even the ones we know already, are horrific, and more power to the survivors. And I'm going to say more about that in just a second. But politically, nothing has stuck to Donald Trump. And there's a lot that we are now hearing about again because of the Epstein files that people just blew over in the past because it didn't catch. The Epstein files caught. And the Epstein files caught because this was an issue that MAGA cared deeply about. They believed, because of things Trump had said, that the Epstein files were full of Democrats. Remember, this is when they were going to finally get Bill Clinton, who, by the way, has been out front saying, release them all. Anything I've got to tell you, I'm happy to tell you. Same with his wife, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. A lot of MAGA people voted for him because they truly believed that there was a group of extremely wealthy, well-connected global elites that were raping children and perhaps doing even worse things. And when the Trump administration, Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, at the FBI, Pam Bondi is at the Attorney General, Kash Patel's at the Director of the FBI. When they came out and said there's nothing to see here, MAGA smelled a rat. which, by the way, if you've ever smelled a rat, um, a rotting rat, there's a reason they talk about smelling a rat. Let me tell you, I had one on my walls once. Um, that has caught. And as it caught, and as Congress said, yeah, release them all, and as Clinton said, yeah, release them all, and as we're starting to see them come out, and we're starting to see things like that incredibly petty and um, threatening act of the DOJ not to redact the names and addresses and sometimes a sexually explicit photos involving survivors, but instead redacting the names of people saying things like, I loved the torture memo. I mean, the torture video. Um, that issue has only heated up. And the more we know, the more it looks as if MAGA was right to believe there was an elite global group of extremely wealthy people who were sexually assaulting children and perhaps doing other things as well. The trick is, it was people around those like Donald Trump. It was not people around those like Bill Clinton. And that right there threatens dramatically to destabilize any possible coalition that Trump could put together for 2026 and for the MAGA Republicans beyond. All right, so why James Talarico? That's the second time the FCC under Brendan Carr has gone after somebody who does an interview with James Talarico. Now, James Talarico is a representative from Texas. He's a state representative from Texas, and he is running for the Democratic nomination for senator in Texas. And his competitor in the primary is Jasmine Crockett, who is currently a national representative, a U.S. representative from Texas. And they're both terrific. And I'm not even going to pretend to endorse either one of them. I think they are both absolutely shining lights. They're very, very different people, and they bring very different things to the table. This is one of the things that I always say about this kind of a period in American history, is that we're going to see a lot of good people, a lot of good names doing really cool stuff. Both of them we're going to continue to see for the rest of their lives. They're both that good. But what Talarico has, I think, and why the Trump administration is far more concerned about him than they are about Crockett, is less about the Senate seat than it is about the fact that James Talarico is a seminary student. He's lived in Texas for, I think, 8 generations. He is himself studying to become a minister. And what he has done as really kind of his hallmark is he has taken on the Christian claims of the white nationalists, of the white Christian nationalists, to say that they are not only un-American, but that they are un-Christian. He insists on the separation of church and state because he says that the use of the Bible, the use of Christianity for politics, perverts Christianity. And I grabbed a thing here that he said earlier on the Stephen Colbert show. He said that politicizing Christianity distorts politics and cheapens faith. The only true way in which Christianity should be inserted into politics is by adhering to the fundamental principle of Christianity that you should love your neighbor, love God and your neighbor, and that you should therefore feed the hungry, welcome the stranger, and heal the sick. And this is a quote from him. He says, "There is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. It is the worship of power in the name of Christ, and it is a betrayal of Jesus of Nazareth." If the Trump people lose the support of evangelical Christians over Epstein, and somebody like James Talarico gives them an off-ramp to get off of this Christian nationalist project that the administration is on, um, the MAGA will collapse. What is the only people who are still behind Donald Trump are the white Christian nationalists in the Republican Party. We know that from a new poll that came out today. That's it. That's their base. If they start listening to James Talarico, and if he shows up I mean, he doesn't have to be in the Senate for them to listen to them. If he shows up on The View, which is where he was, or if he shows up on Stephen Colbert, or I interviewed him as well, the more places that people hear the idea that intervention in politics of Christianity perverts both, which, by the way, takes us back to the way people thought about putting Christianity in politics before 1980. It's really Ronald Reagan who brings in the evangelical Christians into his coalition in the 1980s. The more people who say, let's go back to the world where we kept our churches and our politics separate, the less chance that the administration has of staying in power. So I think if you end up there with the attack on anybody giving airtime to James Talarico, with an argument from a rule that it's called it's not the fairness doctrine. It's called the equal time rule, that says that if you are giving during an election season, if you're giving time to one candidate, you have to give equal time to all the other candidates, unless you are a news show. And that has always been interpreted to include talk shows. And Carr is saying, no, that's not the case. But so far, he's only saying it with regard to James Talarico. So he's trying to change the rules to make sure people don't listen to James Talarico. And to that end, I think it is worth noting that when I last looked today, which was at about 3:00, more than 2 million people had watched that segment. And I would urge you to go do it, just so that you add your numbers to it. But so what does all of this add up to? I think what it adds up to is the idea that the Trump administration has really doubled down and is making very clear its determination to create a white Christian nationalist nation that walks away from representative democracy, that walks away from international trade agreements, and that walks away from international security, defense agreements. But that is pretty obviously making the United States weaker and turning it into a place where cronies and people like Donald Trump's family can get really, really, really rich off the rest of us, because we're the ones who are going to be holding the bag for all of this, the debt and the deficit, and the unfunded airstrikes and all those sorts of things. That's going to be us paying for that. And I think what you are seeing is a recognition on the part of the government, with the pushback against federal agents from ICE and Border Patrol, with frustration over the corruption, certainly over the Epstein files. You're seeing real concern that the fever that has gripped the United States for at least 10 years, but I would argue all the way back to the 1980s, is starting to break. All right, that's a lot more than you bargained for, I think. But again, it was one of those days. I always talk about the light bright, but it was one of the days where all the light brights seemed to me to just make up this pattern. I mean, they were little lights, like the thing about the prediction markets, but it was kind of obvious once you started putting it right in place in the light bright. I did want to leave you, as usual, with something you can do, a number of things you can do. There's the obvious things I always talk about, right? Call, run for office, and so on. I do want to reiterate that what we really have seen around the country is that it is taking care of your neighbors that has broken federal agents, that has forced Americans or has forced the government to say Americans don't want what we are serving, and to at least pretend to pull out of places like Minnesota. But I had a conversation today with a candidate a candidate from North Carolina. And she said something that I really loved. And she said she was talking to a Tibetan religious leader who said she was concerned that she had insulted him. She spoke right before she did, and right before he did, and she apologized for she had spoken profanely, and she apologized right before a religious leader, and she apologized. And he said, no, 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 no. You and I are doing the same thing. We're just doing it differently. And he said to her, everybody in the world has one torch to pick up, and everybody's torch is different. And you can't carry somebody else's torch, but you have an obligation to pick up your torch, whether it's to run for office, or whether it's to help out at the schools, or whether it's to, make books available to children whose schools have had to take them off the shelves, or whether it's to feed people, or whether it's to fight back against the concentration camps, or whether it's to write letters, I hope. Each one of us has some kind of a torch to carry, and nobody but us can carry that particular torch. And it's our job to pick that torch up and carry it as long as we can. And I love that idea. It's what I've been trying to say when I'm like, sometimes delivering flowers matters. That's a really weak way to say, whatever your skill is, offer it to the world, and it'll find a home. And in this moment, there's going to be so many places that we need so many people. Now is the time to make sure that you are carrying a torch. Part of that for me going forward, and I'm trying to start doing this more, is thinking about what I really want on the other side of this. Because there is going to be another side, whether it's tomorrow or in 50 years. What kind of a world do we want to have? And putting your mind to work, trying to figure that out, where your lane is, where you think you can contribute, that is going to be really important when that moment comes, because then we're absolutely going to have all hands on deck. But that part of it's going to be fun. So give a little bit of thought about, what matters to you. What do you want your community to look like? What do you want your government to look like? This is the moment we're in, where we are getting to start to define that. And part of carrying a torch for the United States is trying to figure out what we want of it. All right, I went way over today. Sorry about that. Tons of stuff to cover, but I will be back on Thursday. And if you are watching on YouTube, or if you're following me on YouTube, I've got a lot of really good interviews coming up, and all the interviews lately have been really terrific. So, and I've got a real surprise, to me, a very surprising one coming up. I'd give you the dates, but I don't remember. We do list them. It's probably worth keeping an eye on the interviews that I've got coming up, because I learn a lot, and I suspect you will as well. And it turns out a lot of our elected officials are pretty human and pretty good at what they do, which is always nice to hear. All right. Thank you for being here, and I will see you on Thursday. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend, about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.